And welcome, students, to our next lesson. As we continue our journey into talking a little bit about some ethics in computing, we're going to discuss the whole idea of things being acceptable and ethical, again, with this time just focusing more on the ethical side. So, in order to kind of kick this off, we first need to kind of know what computer ethics is. So, ethics, when we're talking about computing, and specifically computing, are issues that can either be raised or amplified by that of technology. Now, we're not going to go through every single issue out there because there's a lot of them, but we're going to talk about some of the more common ones that are prevalent today. So, when we look at these issues, one of the very first ones to discuss is that of privacy. It is probably, I'd say, one of the bigger issues actually out there right now in regards to some of the different things that are going on in the tech sector. Now, the threat of privacy has been increasing in part because computing technology enables an enormous amount of information gathering to occur in subtle or undetectable ways, like ways you won't even know. There's all sorts of dating mining tools out there for advertisements and using information that you might have on a public profile that they'll sell out to third-party advertisers, stuff like that. Well, this dating mining process, it usually happens through things such as purchases. So if you buy something online, that information might get sold to advertisers, for example. So it's like, hey, you went and just bought this new video game. Hey, here's some other video games that are just like it that you might like. And it doesn't have to be sold to a third party. It could be that same company. It's like, hey, you like this game? Here's some more recommendations. Cookies, which is not the edible kind. This is the kind that is stored on your computer. It's just like a little text file, typically. And these are things that are just used to kind of keep track of like where you've been, kind of little scripts that you might have, and advertising, which I've already mentioned. All right, all these things will take your personal information. They'll collect it. Whether it's like just your name, it could be your, like I said, your shopping habits, your browsing habits. Now you went and looked up information online about, maybe you're looking up a new set of running gear for your truck. Well, all of a sudden now you're going to be looking at that kind of related information showing up. Right? These information are collected from the many sources and they're potentially then assembled into databases. All right, these are like giant warehouses of advertising that are then merged, matched, and mined by other companies in order to construct a profile on the life of that individual. So they'll start knowing like, well, this person really likes to do this. So for example, me, I do lots of technology, so they're probably like, hey, here's a lot of cool, nerdy technology-like stuff that you might be interested in. Now, the whole thing with this is kind of leads to a little bit of fear that the details of individual lives are known by other people. Like you're not really able just to have a private life. You can't completely shut yourself off because people know exactly what you're going to be interested in. The next thing from this is that of intellectual property. Now, due to the significant growth in the digitization of art, photos, music, movies, and even video games, digital information is copied relatively easily and accurately. Now, there are many who would advocate for things such as open source software that say, hey, traditional intellectual restrictions don't apply because, when we do something like this where it's online, well, multiple people can test it and they can, give their feedback and their improvement. All these good things. But the people who are more on the proprietary side say, well, that might be true, but there's a certain sense of pride and profit that go into generating digital products that may not otherwise be used because, there's a monetary incentive. All right, next we have rights and responsibilities. When we start examining that of the information that transmits in the digital age that we live in, one thing you have to understand is not restricted by traditional borders. And when I say traditional borders, I mean borders between one nation and the next. Right? Different countries have different laws and customs that affect how that data is transmitted to their users. For example, in China, they have a lot of restrictions typically on things like free speech. So you have to understand that they can't just say whatever because of those restrictions. So then the question starts becoming, well, how does the country stop or punish a violator of their laws based upon an individual who is located either in some remote location in the world, so they may not belong to the country, maybe they're a citizen of it, but they're overseas, but they may be sharing or accessing content in their country. So they, what's their policy, what's their procedure for that? How do they censor that information? All right, and the next one, of course, is that of hacking and security. Can't talk about unethical actions without discussing that of hacking and security. Security is kind of a fundamental problem on the internet due to the fact that computers can act from a distance over networks and thereby accomplish goals without being observed. Like, there's not always going to be somebody standing over your shoulder every time to tell you what is right and what is wrong. Now, because of this, issues such as hacking, identity theft, disruption of services to things like such as a denial of service attack, these are all examples of potential hazards that can occur to users. So ultimately, you start wondering, well, how can I tell the difference with what I'm doing? These seem some extreme examples. How can I tell what I'm doing is ethical or unethical? It's a very good question. How do we tell that difference? Well, how do we know whether what we're doing is ethical or not unethical? Now, probably one of the easiest starting points is to understand that while individual laws vary from country to country, these form the basis of what may be considered ethical actions, right? Whereas actions that violate these laws may be considered unethical. Now, I'm not saying that the law is always right, because it may not be. If the law was something that restricted your freedom of expression, and you're just simply trying to express maybe your opinion about a company, and you're like, hey, I got this product, I wasn't happy with it, I just want to let everyone else know the reason why. And if the law says you can't do that, well, obviously that is a restriction on your freedom of expression. So it may not necessarily be considered, in some regards, ethical or unethical. But again, the laws kind of form a good baseline to start with. So keeping that in mind, let's look at our first example. And when we're looking at these examples, we're looking at this mostly from like a Western perspective. So intellectual piracy is the first example we're looking at here. And when we're talking about this is the illegal distribution of music, movies, books, and other intellectual media. Piracy in this regard is an illegal infringement of copyrights held by the owners of the media. So that would be anything from an illegal song or movie being uploaded onto the internet. Now, businesses can use information obtained through the piracy people, and they can send out what is a cease and desist letter, and pretty much take it down or also take legal action. Right. So, and sometimes it won't necessarily be directed at the person that uploaded, but it might be the person who has where that upload occurred. So, for example, that's why cease and desist letters, kind of things like this, will, like you hear a lot with, like for YouTube, for example, they'll send, they'll file a complaint. Doesn't necessarily go directly to the user. The user might get notified from that person, but it's usually YouTube that takes the action. Now, there are, of course, fines and legal recourse that can occur if these laws aren't complied with. Now, an example of intellectual privacy, as I kind of alluded to, first when a business may use, let's say, a well-known song, but they're using a popular song that's on the radio today, for an instructional or promotional YouTube video without obtaining the rights or providing proper attrition. Now, if you don't have the proper attribution in there, obviously that can cause some grief. There are some things with fair use that we'll talk about where you can kind of get around this a little bit, but for the most part, you can't just like, hey, I just want to use a song. No, this is not quite how that works. And when we talk about copyright, again, we'll look at this a little bit more fine-tooth. But very similar to this, though, is the topic of trade secrets. Piracy isn't the only type of intellectual property that is unethically distributed by computer use. Competitors can use any number of methods to gain access to proprietary information that other companies can pay millions to develop. That often includes patented or patent-pending information, and this doesn't have to be necessarily physical hardware. This can also pertain to things such as software. So if there's let's say, a new software algorithm that has been developed, and you go and you leak that to the competitors, obviously that would be considered an unethical violation. Intellectual property theft is often achieved by internal moles, so people who work inside the company, or contract workers who have access to a company's computer server. So it may not be somebody that necessarily works directly with the computer. You could be contracted to come and maybe work for 6 months to a year or 18 months, whatever your contract period is. And you come in, you work for the company, and you discover, hey, I could take this information when I leave here and sell it to somebody else for a bunch of money. Now, example that I've kind of mentioned already, but is a programmer who leaves for another company mid-project to sell the ideas of the original company. That would be considered unethical because, again, you're selling off, in this case, a trade secret. All right, just if you have worked really hard on something, you worked hard, and you're working with, like, let's say you're working with your best friend, you guys are building this really awesome thing about, you get, let's say, 3/4 of the way building it, and then your friend says, hey, I need to go, next door real quick. And you go next door, and you find out he's been taking the same ideas of what you've been doing and giving it to this other person who now has something even better maybe than what you did, but they're basing off of your ideas. All right, example 3 is that of identity theft. Organizations must protect consumer information as identity theft directly affects their customers. If you're not familiar with the concept of identity theft, that is literally where your identity, like your name, your personal information, social security, gets stolen, and then people set up false accounts in your name. All right, companies of all sizes are susceptible to data breaches. A data breach is where like the personal information that stores like customer information, such as name, address, social security, that's stolen. It's not a good thing to be in the position of. The hackers can obtain everything from your names, date of birth, social security, addresses, contact information, and they use it to create phone accounts. The more information they have on you, the more potential damage they can do. Now, not properly protecting that private information is quite costly to businesses and can result in legal fines and, of course, lawsuits because you didn't protect their personal information. That person now has to get their life sorted out because they're going to have to probably spend more money to try and reclaim their identity and fix up whatever mess was made. All right, and of course, our next one is that of financial theft. This is very similar to that of identity theft because it is still theft, but it's not necessarily you're taking out the person's name and opening up a bunch of accounts with it, but instead you're more just targeting just their finances. Because identity theft, you can do, it's not just like, hey, I'm going to steal your money. It's, hey, I'm going to steal your money and ruin your name. Financial theft is simply just, hey, I'm going to take $1,000 of all these people's accounts, so I'm going to put an offshore account so I can be rich. All right. The hacker in this example typically redirect the donation system, let's say, of a nonprofit, and they're going to have that money sent to an offshore account controlled by the hacker. So that way the money's not traceable because when it's offshore, it's no longer within the country of origin. This unethical practice pretty much essentially tricks a website buyer into thinking a website transaction is complete, when in fact the business never gets notice of the sale, and the money is effectively lost offshore. All right, and that's going to wrap it up, folks. Hopefully that has given you some good examples to chew on. I know it's kind of similar to a lot what we talked about with acceptable use. We'll have one more lesson kind of like this, where we'll kind of talk about what are some of those ramifications. I know we discussed fines and legal action, but let's look at that also from the scope lens of a student and just see what other kind of things can occur. So I will see you again next time.